All right, 10:02. All systems are go. I think we'll get going here. So very first thing first, you'll notice that, I guess you noticed me handing it around earlier, but you'll notice that I gave you this little one-page kind of questionnaire, I guess, just two simple questions, one of which you might not be able to answer until later in the lecture, but one of them is just kind of practice for stuff we've done in the last couple of classes. So what I have in mind here, there you go, yep. What I have in mind here is that it's kind of a low stakes situation where you can get some in the back too if you don't want to come all the way up here. It's kind of a low stakes situation where you can just kind of answer a question or two. I'm going to collect it. It's my way of taking attendance. And then, we have a TA. Hopefully you received the email about that. And so what the TA will do is quickly look at it and will just check your answer, see if you're right or wrong. But of course, you'll get full credit as long as you've done it, right? So it's really for your own interest, right? I'm trying to kind of surprise you here and see if you can actually, just see what you know off the top of your head if you're able to do this question. So there's some of the forms are in the back over there. I'll put, you know how I don't like to put anything on the table over there? Maybe what I'll do is I'll do this. Sorry, give me 1 second. If you need to grab one, they're right here in front of the class on a chair. So, and at the end of class, you can either drop them in the boxes in the back or hand them directly to me. Once again, it's just purely credit, no credit. It's my way of taking attendance today, but you know what? Let's make it meaningful so you get a little bit of a, impromptu test of your knowledge, we'll say, right? Okay, and maybe I will, I'll remind you about, try to do it about halfway through the class, remind you that that's there. So here we are, lecture 6. And it's an exciting day. We're really going to put some of the machinery we've been talking about to the test, right? And start to see what we can do with these concepts that we've been talking about the last couple of classes. Equilibrium, consumer surplus, producer surplus, so on. But before we get there, let me just handle the usual administrative details here. So as of now, and today what we'll be talking about the materials in chapters 6, 7, and 8. I'll show you the top hat in a second. First, let me remind you about the calendar here. Today is the 19th, I believe. Monday the 23rd, I'm going to hand out all of our review materials, right? That is to say, I'll post a practice exam for the online component of the exam. I will hopefully have duplicated a practice exam for the in-class component, right, that you'll look at, but I'll also post that. All of that stuff will go out to you Monday. Then we'll do our usual lecture thing. It's actually a very interesting and important day. And then Thursday, next Thursday, a week from today, we'll go over everything, right? And then, of course, September 30th, Monday, will be our first exam date. So just to, we still have, it's 11 days away, but we're almost a month into the semester. We'll be a little bit more than a month into the semester by that point. So just let me remind you that now is a great time to kind of ramp up your efforts. If you look at the Top Hat site for the course, here you can see, you have all of the lecture notes, all of the lecture recordings, right? Well, not yet today, obviously, but and over here you'll see all of the materials that have been assigned. So, by the way, all of these should now be accessible, right? Homeworks 1 through 5, chapters 1 through 8, and just so I can check to see if that's true, I'll look right here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I just assigned these in the last couple of days, and then chapters 1 through 8, right? So that's kind of the universe of expectations, dates, and what is required of you. And hopefully you received my email about our TA, Ishii, who I met with yesterday, is fantastic. So please take advantage of Ishii if you, for example, can't meet during my regular office hours. Unfortunately, I'm sort of circumscribed to just do mine during the day. So please take advantage of that resource if you can. So I think that about covers everything. The attendance exercises are hopefully floating around. A couple people came in once again just for me to take attendance and you to get a little practice, right, in a low stakes environment. So I guess without further ado, we'll dive in. Okay, so I think I said all this stuff. Just let me quickly assess what's going on here. Yeah, in terms of, people have brought up that a couple of the questions are a little squirrely in terms of grading on the homework. That is to say, they might give you full credit, but they mark your answer incorrect. These are typically things that you have to upload, that I have to look at by hand. So unfortunately, you won't have a definitive answer until once the homework's closed, which is October 2nd, right? But that having been said, usually if it's draw a diagram, I'm not a stickler for, whether or not you got it exactly right. I'm just sort of making sure you did it in good faith in those cases, right? Like you didn't just draw a big X on a paper and upload it or something. So don't worry too much about that, right? Okay, so last time we talked about these notions of consumer and producer surplus, right? Ultimately, what these things allow us to do is measure, in some ways, the total gains from exchange that are created in a market, right? We call this various things. I like to call it total gains from exchange. Oftentimes we will refer to it as total societal welfare. But that's kind of what we mean, right? We mean that when we get this thing called the market together, there's buyers and sellers. Everybody's rational, doing the best for themselves, right? And what this means is you buy stuff when the value you get from it is greater than the price. You sell stuff when the cost of providing it are less than the price. Put all of that together, everybody's gaining a little bit. We take consumer and producer surplus, right? And that's a way of measuring how much everybody gains here. So I might have just slid this past you in the interest of getting the mechanics going last time, but it's really quite an achievement, right? That we're able to measure gains, in particular to consumers, right? That's not an obvious thing that you can do without some sort of methodology, right? How do you measure satisfaction and all of that stuff? Well, here we've sidestepped it a little bit by saying, well, your demand curve kind of reveals what you're willing to pay, and so what we can do is measure your benefits using that, right? And so the fact that we've been able to do that now allows us to compare or think about various interests and how they change as the market changes. So it's an interesting thing. Maybe I'll say more about the broader philosophical implications later in a class. Let's make sure we get the mechanics straight for now. So remember how this worked here. When we were thinking about values and prices and what people spend in consumer surplus, we decided last time that this demand curve traces out not just what people are buying, but also the marginal benefits that people get for a product, right? Marginal benefits, of course, dictate what you're willing to pay at most for a product. And so we can look at our diagram kind of like this. Our new understanding of the demand curve goes something like this. If we think about, say, this 5,000th this pizza, we're going to change markets, by the way, today. I've kind of beaten the pizza market to death here. This 5,000th pizza, we observed that someone would pay $15 for this, right? Which means that their valuation for the pizza, the marginal benefit they derive from the pizza, is about $15, right? When this person pays $10 for it, well, they're in effect getting a $5 surplus. As we move up and down the demand curve, right, the difference between what someone would have paid and what they pay can be just sort of read right off the curve. So somebody would have paid 20, they pay 10 in a market, right? Everybody pays the same price. They walk away with $10 in surplus. Just like someone right around here, well, they would have paid $10.01. They pay 10, they get a penny of surplus. But everybody gets some surplus, right, when they buy pizzas in this market, right? And so, of course, this has maybe the simplest geometric object, right? In that if we wanted to think about the total amount paid for the product, well, it's right there, right? It's that blue rectangle, which is the quantity times the price. Of course, the demand curve above says something about what the whole benefit is. So I think I kind of said all this stuff. I will. I'm going to come back and talk a little bit more about one of the things on the previous slide. But this is kind of what we arrived at, right? That we now have this geometrical understanding of the area under the demand curve. So if we add up all of those surpluses, right, that people get, we did this with funny bar charts last time, we find that what we wind up having is this area below the demand curve but above the price as being all of the surpluses that people earn from participating in this market, all the buyers I should say, right? So what we could do is we could read this in any number of ways, and in fact it's useful to sort of just remind you that if you take green plus blue, right, that's kind of the total satisfaction people are getting in the market, right? It's the sum of all the willingnesses to pay, or the sum of all the marginal benefits in the market, right? Blue plus green. If you subtract out the blue, well, that is total satisfaction minus what people spend to get it, and then you're left with the surplus, which is just the green, right? So that's one way of understanding this diagram here. Of course, one thing I mentioned on the last slide is that we talked a little bit about how this concept that marginal benefit is decreasing, right? As you consume more and more of something, you get less and less additional satisfaction, right? I'm going to remind you, this is my way of sneaking into this lecture, this idea of a marginal value in economics, right? Given you have X, how do you value X plus 1? Well, we say that in general, the value that you place on X plus 1 is less than X, right? So given you have some amount of a good, how much do you value an additional unit? Well, we saw that one assumption we make about this marginal benefit is that in general it's decreasing, right? As you get more of something, you can think about it any way you like, you get satiated and you're willing to pay less for even more of it, right? Might be one way of saying it. This is the law of diminishing marginal utility. We didn't say really anything about utility. I'm leaving that for your other economics classes, 200, 300. But that's the principle, right? That these marginal benefits are decreasing. And of course, that was what allowed me to kind of conclude that this demand curve was downward sloping, right? That people pay less and less and less for additional units. Right, so this is what I was saying, is that we have this additional information on the graph. Here I'm saying that the value is encoded in the demand curve. Down here we can see that total expenditures are this blue shaded rectangle, right? So I'm pushing us towards this understanding of the graph here. So I kind of, this geometric understanding I should say. So I kind of say all of that here. Our formal name for this area above the demand curve, but below, above the price, but below the demand curve, is consumer surplus. And so here I've shaded it in. And let me just remind you about the various aspects of this geometry here. So this down here, this blue square, is the amount paid. You might say that the green plus the blue is something like the total valuation, right? It's the summation of the benefits that each unit creates, the total benefits, right? So that we would say that someone values that first unit around 20, someone values the 5,000th unit around 15, someone values the 10,000th unit around 10, right? Those are the total valuations, green plus blue. Well, blue is also what people spend, right? Everybody spends the going price for a unit of the product, right? That's kind of how a market works. There is a price, even though the valuations are all different. So if you take the blue plus the green and you subtract out the blue, you get the net benefit, right? The surplus, what we call the consumer surplus, right? And that's all what we talked about last lecture. Okay, so one thing that's interesting about all this, and this crops up at various points in policy debates. I happen to be a pretty avid sports fan. And periodically, I guess now Buffalo is a city that's trying to get a new stadium built. But something that reminds me of this whole consumer surplus thing has to do with these debates about whether or not we should build stadiums, right? If the public should spend money building the stadiums. And so if you look at this, you look at this article, you'll see the usual sorts of things that are accentuated in these arguments. So revenues, they're always talking about revenues, what people are spending. So Inglewood, is that, okay, that's California, will gain this amount to that amount in annual revenue, right? And so they're talking about expenditures. And you can see here they have St. Louis trying to keep the Rams. So St. Louis kind of triggers me a little bit because, I'm a native New Englander, of course. My home team was the Patriots, right? Still is, I guess. Still my team. But back in the early 90s, there was this huge, New England, the Patriots were in flux. They were sold. They were going to move to St. Louis because they couldn't get a stadium, right? And in the meanwhile, they were the worst team in the NFL. They had the worst stadium, Foxborough. It was like a dirt parking lot with like aluminum benches, and it was terrible. And Robert Kraft bought the team and then built his own stadium and all that stuff. And it turns out the next couple of decades were pretty good for the Patriots. I guess if you're a Jets fan, there's hope, right, after all. But at the time, there was talk of the team just moving to St. Louis, right, because they couldn't get the stadium built. But nowadays, you see all this, the stadiums, the cost of these things goes into hundreds of millions, into the, billions. And they always reference the revenues that are going to be made by the stadium. So what I'd like to sort of accentuate for you is what they're kind of talking about here is they're talking about the blue area, right? They're talking about expenditures on stadium stuff, right? The tickets, the concessions, all that. Well, what we really care about if we're interested in welfare is the green thing, right? We care about not the revenues, but the surplus, right? And you might just sort of reflect a little bit upon what would make the surplus bigger or smaller under different circumstances, right? One thing I can hint at here that you could think about is how responsive demand is, right? So you might sort of think about what would happen if you pivoted demand and made it flatter, right? We talked about how this was something like a more responsive demand curve, meaning small changes in price mean big changes in quantity. That would make the green thing smaller, right? If you made it steep, right, that would tend to make the size of the green thing bigger, and that might have some impact on what you think about debates like this. Should public works or public monies be spent on these things? So you might say, well, is the demand for a sports team unresponsive or responsive to price? Inelastic, elastic. That's an interesting question. I don't have an answer to that. Okay. And by the way, next time we're going to talk about taxation a little bit. I know that's an exciting subject, but it actually is exciting. And we'll have much more to say about the relative slopes of curves in that setting. So one thing that's interesting is that if you go back to the very birth of the concept of consumer surplus, it was more or less invented or discovered as we now know it by this fellow by the name of Jules Dupuy, who is a French engineer. Right? And it turns out that a lot of economics was developed by people like Dupuy. It was around the early 1800s, where you could say the Enlightenment was in full swing. Science was developing rapidly, and in France they had a whole series of pretty famous technical schools, right? Like the École Polytechnique. And Dupuy, I think, went to that. Let me just check here. I think he was. Yeah, École Polytechnique. And I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. But what he was interested in when he developed this concept of consumer surplus was problems of public works. So, think about it this way. You're an engineer. You're, trying to figure out, you do things like build bridges and all of that stuff. Stadiums, I guess, in the modern time. So he was interested in these things. And not only was he interested in how to build the bridges, but he also got involved in this question as to whether or not you should do it, right? How valuable is the bridge? And he hit upon this idea of sort of changing taxes, or tolls, I guess, for bridges, right? Bridge crossings, and then seeing how many people would cross at different prices, and then using that information to figure out how valuable the bridge would be to the public, even if it were free, right? And that's kind of what we're doing here with consumer surplus. We're looking at areas under the demand curve. So we will see in a couple of weeks when we really get going with all of this. Alfred Marshall, he kind of builds this concept into a whole system where we think about, firms and costs and all and profits and all this stuff all in surplus, all on one diagram, and it's really kind of a neat apparatus. Okay, so that's my review of a consumer surplus. Of course, if we reinterpret everything and look at the supply side of the market, we get much the same way of looking at it. So you'll see here on this graph, I have it labeled so it says supply equals marginal cost, and indeed we accentuated this last time, right? That the supply curve encodes costs, right? Lurking behind the scenes again is this assumption that suppliers are rational. When the money they make goes above costs, they supply costs of producing an additional unit. They supply an additional unit. When the price goes below that, they don't. The consequence is that the supply curve traces out the costs of producing each unit given some amount has already been produced, right? Marginal costs, as we would understand it. Given we're producing X, what does it cost to produce the X plus 1st unit, right? And it traces it out here. So my example, the 10,000th unit costs right around $10 to produce, right? That's one consequence of this. So, right, and I'm trying to accentuate that this has to do with rationality at the end of the day, too. Everybody maximizing, I guess you could say, their profits. Don't like to say that for reasons we'll see in a week or two, but you might think about it that way. One consequence of this is, once again, the market price is the same for everybody. If you imagine that it's $10 there, even though this 5,000th unit costs someone $5 to produce, they still get the market price for it. So the difference is, in some sense, a surplus, right? A profit from that unit. So as you sort of think about the units costing this, they're all getting that. The difference between the 10 and the curve then gives the profit from that unit, right? The surplus, I'll say, from that unit. So you can put it all together, and you arrive at a picture like this. Right? Where you see down here, this red shaded area captures the costs of producing the pizza, right? Each unit of pizza, I should say, given a certain amount has already been produced. And then, since all units get the same price in a market, the surplus is just the difference between the price and the cost of producing the unit. The sum then is this whole area. And we did this all, maybe not so elegantly, but maybe more intuitively, using bar diagrams and all of that stuff last time, right? Okay. So once we put it together, we now have the green and the blue here together represent total gains from exchange or total societal welfare emanating from this market. Now, I do kind of wish that I had shaded in this area down here as well, because it's kind of nice to show all of this information, all of these things that we've built into our demand and supply apparatus. Demand capturing marginal benefit, supply capturing marginal cost, consumer surplus. In your mind's eye, picture this whole thing as being expenditures, revenue. You can think of costs down here, but producer surplus here, right? All these the geometry has an enormous amount of information about the graph, right? And so one of the neat things about this is everything is measured in dollars, right? I guess it's not so hard, or in common currency, I should say. That's not so crazy to think about producers, right? I mean, they obviously deal in dollars all the time, right? But if you're thinking about benefits, and you're talking about satisfaction, that's a hard thing to measure. Yet we've come up with a measure of it, and this allows us to put everything on the same graph, right? And it also allows us to compare what consumers are getting out of a market with what producers are getting out of a market, right? All in the same dollar terms. So I mention this because, there's often a lot of, especially if you go back in history, I have an example from the mercantilist era here. So mercantilism, I'm sure you learned about it in high school. It's kind of that age of exploration, from the age of exploration onwards, a little bit policy. There's a lot of trade ramifications, but another big part of this mercantilist policy was monopoly, right? Was making conditions, I should say, generally amenable to businesses or firms. So you think about the British government supporting the British East India Company or the Dutch East India Company. That was part of it. And there's also this big policy about making things easy for firms so they wouldn't have to deal with competition domestically. So I've spent a fair amount of time traveling in Germany. And you go around Germany, I guess England too, and each little town has its own brewery, and this is nice, but I can't help but wonder if it's a vestige of mercantilism, that some noble, the local duke granted this business the sole right to produce beer in this area. Now you can think about it this way, right? You sort of say, well, let's see here. That's good for the producer of beer, and in this mercantilist world, we want our producers to be protected. Not so good for consumers, right? But it's good for producers. Well, maybe it's better for producers, they gain more than consumers lose. How would we know? Well, we wouldn't unless we had some way of directly comparing the gains that everybody's getting in the market, and we're going to do some of that today, right? I'm going to hopefully show you that we can use these diagrams because they have the same scales in such a way to do this. So, an important aspect of this is this kind of bigger question, and it's about the efficiency of the equilibrium in a market. So we've talked about supply and demand and where they come together and what this means for price and quantity. But what we're going to be able to do is think about what this means for total societal welfare in this market, right? Total societal welfare in this market. And what I'm going to maintain over this class and the next class is that you can't do any better than what the market is giving you in terms of getting those surpluses to be as large as possible. That is to say, if we try to fiddle with this market to get it to do something else, what we wind up doing is reducing societal welfare, right? And this is maybe the first glimpse you've seen of this idea that markets provide efficient results, right? And of course, it's interesting because I've tried to accentuate this. Throughout the whole thing, everything that we've said is a result only of a person or a business sort of, they think about their situation. I say, what do I get from buying in this market? What does it cost me to participate? Right? I value a pizza at $18. It costs $10. I'll buy one. They're not thinking about anything else, right? Just themselves. Same with businesses. I can supply a pizza for $7. They're going for $10. I should do it, right? So you might look at this and say that everybody is rational and self-interested, right? As Adam Smith famously said, everybody is led by an invisible hand to promote an end, which was no part of his intention. Meaning that the market forces, being what they are, the product of rationality, result, when left alone, in some good social objective, right? So the other famous quote is, "It is not by the benevolence of the baker that you receive your daily bread," right? But by his rational pursuit of his own self-interest, by his pursuit of his own self-interest, maybe not the rational part. So that was my appearance in The Wealth of Nations. Baker, right? Okay. So I'm going to this is our first hint of seeing this today. So one concept that we're going to reference a lot today is this concept of deadweight loss. It's a weird term, but it has to do with this notion as to what happens when exchanges can't occur, right? So here's a market. Here's where our pizza market, once again. We're getting tired of the pizza market. We're going to get off of it shortly. I have some great examples for you, provocative and controversial examples. So you can imagine that this market is moving along happily, right? We have these producers producing units of pizza, those consumers consuming it. But imagine for some reason the market just stopped working at 5,000 units, right? Normally, right, if this didn't happen, right, the market would go up to 10,000 units. But if it somehow stopped at 5,000 units, there's a whole bunch of exchanges that never occur, right? There are all these people who could supply pizzas at a cost lower than the valuation of all those people up there, right? And when the market is stopped short of its equilibrium, these people never get served, right? And there's a social loss to this. It's a loss that materializes from lost opportunities to exchange. We call this a deadweight loss. It pops up a lot in economics, and it's important because it's important to accentuate it in this way because you can sort of imagine when you go out there in the real world and you're looking at people trading and all that stuff. And you'll see that some of the things that we'll talk about today are very much a part of the real world. If you want to think about how well those things are doing, you have to have a counterfactual in mind where you say, well, what would happen in the absence of this situation? Maybe there would be more exchanges that I'm not seeing. So maybe I'm harping on this, but the idea is this deadweight loss you don't actually observe in many cases. So, all right. Now I'll dive right in here and show you how all of this works, but we're going to contemplate over this class and the next one, right before our first exam, a whole bunch of kind of experiments where we intervene in the market. And you can sort of think about this as, what we're trying to do is we're trying to do something to change the nature of the market, right? Maybe for good reasons. So, two prominent examples of this are the top two bullet points there, price ceilings and price floors. So a price ceiling, be careful about this, usually means we're passing some sort of law to keep the price of something low, right? So the ceiling, we're bumping up against it from below, and I'll show you how this works in a second, right? So a ceiling holds the price down. And you can think about reasons why you might want to do this. So one example is rent control, right? Where you're passing a law to try to ensure that housing or rental housing stays cheap, right? That's an example of a price ceiling because the rent can't go above it. A price floor, in contrast, is usually an attempt to hold the price of something up. So you're trying to keep the price higher than it otherwise is in a market. So the most prominent example, well, there's agricultural price supports, right? We saw that there were price supports for milk in a previous lecture. But the most common example is the minimum wage, right? Where you're trying to intervene in a labor market and say labor should never be sold at less than this particular price. So the floor holds the price up, the ceiling holds the price down, right? Taxes are another intervention in a market, right? We'll think about sales taxes a lot, but we'll save that for next time. There's a lot of interesting technical details there about taxes, but that's another intervention that happens. Yes?
For the price holding of the wages, don't you think it's contradictory that the wages have done so much like
we'll see how it works. It was a question about wages up and all that stuff. Well, let's just look at the supply and demand diagrams. Your comment actually inspired me to add something, and I hope I remember to do it. I think I will, right? So, this isn't a mystery show here, the lecture. What we're trying, so I might as well preview what's going to happen. We're going to see here that ceilings and floors can be seen as redistributors of surplus. That is to say, they take surplus from consumers and give it to consumers, or consumers and give it to producers, or vice versa, right? And that's fine, but we'll see that another result is almost always a deadweight loss. So you can say we can make producers better off at the expense of consumers. That's fine, but in the process we are going to destroy some of the societal welfare. We will create a deadweight loss. We will lose exchanges that otherwise would have happened, right? The implication here, you might sort of, if you had to say this in plain English, you can do things like have price supports for agriculture, and that'll certainly help farmers. It'll help farmers at the expense of consumers, right? The dollar benefits to farmers will not be larger than the dollar losses to consumers. The same is true, you might think about a policy like import quotas on cars, right? Those will, it turn out, they help domestic producers of cars, right? Like they're good for Ford and Chevrolet and all that stuff. But it turns out they hurt consumers, and it turns out the losses to consumers are typically greater than the gains to the producers of the cars. But one thing you can always ask, and I try to harp on this, is that even though these models have pretty stark predictions about what's good and what's bad, that doesn't mean that that's the end of the story. It just means that if you circumscribe everything to think about just this aspect of the story, then you get this. But there are other things that often come into the equation that matter, perhaps enough to offset the things we're talking about. So let's think about how this price ceiling works. And now what I have here, I painstakingly drew these graphs with computers and math. Looks pretty good, right? It's a lot of work went into that graph. Right, so I'm talking about a price ceiling here, and what that is, I don't need to remind you, but I'll say it anyways. The price restricted so that it cannot go above a certain amount, right? And you can think about this as a rental market. Maybe we're talking about the rental market for apartments in Manhattan. So 600,000 units in a month at $3,000 a pop. That's kind of what we're saying here. I've tried to make the units make sense, but that's certainly not a critical part of the argument. And here's the market as it functions before we have any intervention, right? And this is important. As economists, we almost always need a good counterfactual, right? We need to say, all right, well, if we're going to talk about something being good or bad, you have to say compared to what, right? What is your counterfactual? If you ever ask anybody that, they're talking about, well, we should have this policy. You can say, okay, well, how is this going to be better relative to something else? What is your comparison point? Ours is almost always the market functioning as it is, right? And so that's why I've shown you this graph first. Remember what the initial equilibrium is, the price and the quantity, and also the surpluses, right? I'm trying to train you to see these things every time you see a supply and demand diagram. You can even calculate them here, right? The old triangle formula, 0 to 3 is I guess if I turn this way, is the base. 0 to 600, 3 times 600 is, this is 1,800. Did I say, I'm trying to think if I said 18,000 in my early class. I don't know. I'll have to look. 1,800, right? Divide that by 2, you get 900, right? 900, okay. So I'm almost certain I did that wrong in my early class, where I just added a 0. 900 in producer surplus. You can do the same for the top, and you'll see that the result is the same, right? You get 900 in consumer surplus and 900 in producer surplus in this market. I'll write that down. Let's see. I'll just write it here for my reference. Of course, if you add those two together, you get 1,800, and that would be the total gains to exchange, right? The total societal benefits coming from this market, right? So let's try to think through what will happen if we pass a law, a rent control law. My example here is we pass a law that says rent cannot go above 2,000 here, right? The 2. So immediately this suggests a couple of things will happen. First of all, we know that when a price is below equilibrium, right, this creates a shortage, and you can see that on the graph here, right? We have 800,000, I guess, 800 units demanded, and only 400 units supplied at this price. So we do create a shortage, right? More people want units than can get them. Well, in this particular case, you can't sort of fulfill this shortage, and so what happens is the market kind of stops, as I described before, at this 400, right? It has to stop at this 400. And the way I've drawn it here is I said, all right, well, let's think about what happens from units 0 to 400 on the supply side and on the demand side. And you can see here we have producer surplus, right, down here in this area. Now our consumer surplus is up to this 400, this restricted quantity, and below the demand curve yet above the going price. So it's kind of the same rule we used before, but applied to this truncated situation. So maybe just for a little bit to show you the technical aspects of this, I'll copy this over and we'll work it through. So let's see, I have my demand, supply. The initial equilibrium is here. I'll turn this off in a second. 600, 3, and now we're 2, 400, 800. This number up here is 4. And this is a 6. Okay, this is price and quantity. All right. Okay. Let me go like this. Okay, so this is a version of the picture. You'll notice I conveniently wrote the surplus when we didn't have this rent control law in place there. And now what we're trying to do is we're trying to figure out, here we have consumer surplus, right? Here we have producer surplus, right? And so this area, this is 2, this is 400. 2 times 400 is 800 divided by 2 is 400, right? So producer surplus is 400. Now for consumer surplus, we have to be a little bit shifty in how we calculate it out, because we have this kind of trapezoid. One semester a student persuaded me to use the trapezoid area formula, but I was confused by that. So I prefer to just keep it to rectangles and triangles. So this rectangle here, let's see, a height of 2 and a base of 400. So this rectangle is 800. 400 times 2. Yeah? And then we have this up here, which is, this is 2. This is 400. So this is 2 times 400 divided by 2 is 400 again, right? So that's 1,200 like that, right? Consumer surplus 1,200. So if I add these together, I then get societal welfare after, right, the law is enacted. And you can see that after, it's 1,600, whereas before it was 1,800. And maybe you can see the geometrical difference, right? Before we had the law, consumer surplus was up here and producer surplus was down here. Now we have this kind of truncated shape for both of these things together, like this, right? So this is missing, and that is the deadweight loss, right? That is the deadweight loss. Apartments that never change hands, right? Because the price is held artificially low relative to the market. And you can kind of see here how all the various causes work out. One other thing I can mention is that you can see the redistribution of surplus here in this diagram as well. If you sort of think about this whole area as being producer surplus before, well, producers have now lost all of this, right? The new price pushes it down to here and reduces their surplus and hands this rectangle over to consumers, right? So consumers gain some of the producer surplus, but in the process, of course, the deadweight loss is destroyed. So just, point, I know our exam is coming up. I do expect you to be able to look at the diagrams and calculate these things, but it'll always be just rectangles, right? Rectangles and triangles. That's all you need to know here. Yes?
Can we just go over what consumer surplus and producer surplus mean? Like, does it mean, I'm just confused.
Okay, well, if we back way up, we can say that, so the question was, can I just say what consumer and producer surplus are again? Maybe I'll seize this opportunity to go back to the slide here, and that'll allow me to kind of segue into my next point here. So if you'll remember, here in the regular market, demand curve is value, right? And the market price is fixed for all the units. It's 3, right? But values are different for everybody. And in fact, anybody who buys a unit values that unit more than the market price, right? Consumer surplus is the sum of all those values over prices across the whole market. So that's how we're measuring gains to exchange. The same is true, of course, of producers, right? Just to remind you. Everybody in a market gets the going price. Producers who supply the good then can supply it for less than the going price. Producer surplus is the sum of all those differences, the market price versus the cost of supplying the good. So here you can, I kind of wish I had the graphs lined up right on top of each other, so I could go like this and switch back and forth, and you could see the surplus shifting. But you, once again, can maybe see the idea here, right? That we have the area from 2 to 3 on the graph used to belong to producers, but now is part of consumers. And of course, the gray area there just disappears. That's the deadweight loss. That's lost exchanges, right? Okay, so you might look at this and say, okay, there's a deadweight loss to having this price ceiling, or a deadweight loss occurs because of rent control. There may be other reasons, we'll get to this later in class, why you'd want to have rent control. And I'll look to some data, by the way, at the end of class, or some empirical studies, and I'll show you some of the other things that often happen, and you can then decide, you can bring some other things into the argument. But there is still there's still one other thing to mention about all of this, in that this is what the losses are, right? The deadweight loss, if that's all it is, that's great. But you have to accentuate this is a best case scenario, that this is the only bad thing that happens in the market, right? For one, I've assumed that all the units, right, if you remember I slid it right past you there. I assumed that all of these 0 to 400 units went to the top 400 people on the demand curve, right? That somehow they found the highest people on the demand curve. There's no guarantee that's going to happen, right? Why is that the case? Well, you have a rationing problem here. You have all of these people that want product, right? 400 more want the product than can get it at equilibrium. So you have to figure out how you're going to give the units, right? The 400 units you have to the 800 people who want them, the 800 consumers that want them. And there's a whole bunch of ways that you can do this. They typically are outside of a market, right? I'll give you an example. I'll talk about a situation where they're in kind of a pseudo market. They're typically outside of a market, and they could involve something like randomization, right? Picking names out of a hat, a lottery. In fact, that's the way a lot of our rent-controlled units are allocated, right? Via lottery. There's no guarantee that will go to the person who needs it the most, right? So there's that. But there's other things that you could also do. You could be, if you're a landlord, you could say, well, I can't rent this apartment at market rate, so I'll give it to my niece, right? A little nepotism, or even more nefariously, you might say, you know what, I don't like the way that person looks. I'm just going to give it to someone who looks the same way I do, right? That's another way of allocating a unit outside of a market, right? Racism. Okay, so there's no guarantee we get it to the highest valuing users there. But now let's look at this green rectangle, and we might imagine that this is kind of this fulfills a role as kind of a pseudo price. So think about it this way. If you're in the top 400 valuers, right, somewhere between 4 and 6 along the demand curve, well, you have to pay 2, that's the going rate for a market, but in some sense you're willing to pay up to 4, right? And just because you can't do it by law with money, maybe you can do it by some other means, right? You can invest resources in getting the units, and getting this unit. So that could be maybe a kickback to a landlord. Hey, it's just, I know it's $2,000, but if I give you another $2,000 under the table, I give you this favor, I have a car you can have, something like that, right? A kickback, that could also do the trick. And really that's, it's not great, but it redistributes resources back towards the producers or the suppliers, right? So the suppliers wind up capturing it anyway. CUNY alert. So that's one thing that you might want to think about. The other thing, though, that might be worse is this could be some kind of cost that you incur, right? So, for example, you stand in line, right, to get an apartment. Now, that's a little bit worse, I say, because what you wind up doing is using resources, right? Expending actual resources to get the true price up to 4, right? So you can get one of these scarce units. You're willing to stand in line longer than anybody down at this end of the demand curve. But now you've wasted your time. You could have been doing a lot of other things. We know that this opportunity cost matters. So there's that. It might be even something like violence, right? You're willing to kind of, beat up someone else, invest more money in something like that to get the resource. So this is what I said on the previous slide, that this is kind of like dissipating the surplus to ensure you're first in line. That's a technical term for spending the green rectangle. So there we are. And one thing I will say here, or I might accentuate by this, is that just because we've held the price down doesn't mean we don't somehow have to take care of this rationing problem, right? We still have to figure out how to allocate the units we have. And we've removed price from the equation, so how does it get done here? These are the things that I just kind of described, right? Okay. And like I say, at the end of class, I'll look at some empirical evidence, and there might be some basis upon which you want to make a case for rent control, but the pure economic case here, or the pure supply and demand case, I should say, there might be another economic case to make for it, suggests that you'll at least have to think about some of these things. Okay. Let's now look at the other case, right? A price floor. So there's maybe more examples of, well, I don't know if there's more examples, but there's a lot of examples of price floors out there. One example is a lot of agricultural products or dairy products, right, have minimum prices. The idea is to protect farmers. Maybe the best example of this is a labor market, right, where we have minimum wage laws. So this is a little bit different than your standard market that we've been talking about with prices and quantities. So I'll just take a minute here and talk about who the various constituents are here. We have the demanders, right, of labor, and that would be businesses, right? This demand comes from businesses. So in this case, consumers are firms that hire workers, right? In particular, maybe you want to think about this as minimum wage or low-skill labor markets, right? So that's where the demand comes from businesses. Supply comes from people like yourselves, right? Or like me, who you work, you make money, and at least the way the supply curve is going here, you're more willing to work at higher wages, right? As reflected by the curve. So those are the demanders and the suppliers. And so the reason why I'm sort of mentioning this is, or I'm accentuating it, is that in a rent market, you're sort of inclined to, if you're concerned with fairness or whatever, more on that in a second, you're more inclined to kind of side with the consumer, right, the renter, than the supplier who's the landlord. Well, maybe now you're more inclined to side with the supplier who's a worker rather than the firm, which is the consumer, right? So that's to try to keep you from, maybe sort of naturally supposing that, thinking about one interest is better than the other is sort of applies across the board. So once again, we'll do the same exact thing we did before here. We can kind of look at our diagram, and before we start to think about any sort of interference in the market, what we're going to do is we're going to start thinking about what it looks like before there's any interference. So here we have a wage of 10. And we have 2,000 workers per month at this wage of 10, right? We start there, and we can look at our surpluses. The producer surplus is earned by workers. Let's see, it's 0 to 10. 10 times 2,000 is 20,000. Divided by 2 is 10,000. So I'll write that down. Producer surplus is 10,000. Consumer surplus is, let's see, 30 minus 10 is 20 times 2,000, 40,000, divided by 2 is 20,000. Okay, so producers are earning 10,000, consumers are getting 20,000, add those together, that's 30,000 units, right? 30,000 total surplus. Okay, I think I've got everything there. So now we have our benchmark, our starting point. Let's think about a minimum wage law. Here I have a minimum wage coming in at $15. By the way, oftentimes in the real world, minimum wages are, they're below the equilibrium, in which case they don't really do anything, right? So this wage, I might have said this about the shortage. We talked a couple classes ago about how a surplus generates downward pressure on price, right? A shortage generates upward pressure on prices. Well, here, you have the surplus. The market's trying to go to the equilibrium, but it's held away from it, right? And as before, you can kind of see we have, it looks like 1,500 people demanded at a wage of 15, right? Just reading off that point coming down here, the intersection of the black line with the red line. We have 1,500 demanded, yet we have 3,000 workers wanting to work at this wage. So we have a surplus of workers. 1,500 is the amount of the surplus, to be exact, in this market. And so that is the typical story about how a minimum wage can generate unemployment. More people want to work at the wage than businesses want to hire. So, I mean, it's the shape of the curves matters here. We'll get into that more next time. But you can see, maybe it's a little dramatic with this diagram. It doesn't have to be enormous. And that might be something that influences your beliefs about whether or not this is a useful policy or not. So, of course, once again, we only have 1,500 jobs. So we can start off by just sort of imagining that our market runs and then stops to this point. And the result will be the surpluses as we have them drawn here. Producer surplus is the blue area. Consumer surplus is the red area. And remember again who those go to. And maybe I'll calculate them all out for posterity's sake here. Draw my graph quickly. This is 2,000, 10, 15. This is 1,500. This is 3,000. Actually, I'm not doing too badly here. 15, and I believe this is 7.5, 36. Yeah, so I'm trying to see that blue line there. That's my 7.5 here. So I think I have it all. Let's just start doing some calculations here. Maybe I'll have my calculator for this one. So let's see. Producer surplus is now down here, right? Remember, that goes to workers. So let me see what the heck is going on? Let me try to calculate this out. Once again, I'm going to do this as kind of a triangles and rectangles. So I'll first do this bottom triangle here. What is this? This bottom triangle, right? Which is, let's see, 7.5 times 1,500 divided by 2. And that's tough. I find that this is then 5,625, so that's the bottom triangle. Now I'm going to do this rectangle, this here, thereby getting the whole area. 7.5 times 1,500. If I started with the rectangle, could have just done one transaction here. So we get those two things, we add those together. We find that producer surplus is now 16,875. So you can see that we have indeed done kind of the opposite of what happened in the rent ceiling case. We've now transferred some surplus from consumers to producers. Surplus was 10,000. Now it's 16,875. So once again, I know I'm harping on this, but I'm going to say it. The counterfactual here looms large. This idea that we started out by thinking about what the market looked like without the control, and that's forming the basis for our comparisons like this. What about consumer surplus? Well, that's going to be this, 36 minus 15, 30 minus 15 times 1,500. I was almost done in by my own terrible handwriting there. So I find that this whole area here, 15 times 1,500 divided by 2, gives us 11,250, right? And so we can add these two together. And we get 28,125 as our surplus. And so one of the results here As you can see, once again, producer surplus, or consumer surplus was 20,000. Now it's fallen here, but the gain that producers have gotten, the 6,875, is less than what consumers have lost. They've gone from 20,000 to 11,250, and then the difference between this and this gives me this triangle here, the deadweight loss triangle, is 1,875, right? And of course, if you wanted to, you could even just check and see that this triangle here, if you just went and calculated the area directly, you should get the same answer. So once again, I'm assuming you'll be able to do that, but really, the multiplying bases and heights isn't that difficult. You just have to know which concepts match with which. Anything else about all of this? Okay, I think I've said most I wanted to say about that. So let's go back to this. And I had an ulterior motive in breaking out the calculation of the rectangle from the triangle, right? And then I once again pulled the same trick on you that I did before with the rent ceiling case, where I supposed that we ran our market from left to right such that when we got to this cutoff point, all of the units, right, all of the jobs went to the workers who needed them the most, right? They all went to the least cost suppliers. That might not have been the case, right? We have 3,000 people looking for work, 1,500 jobs. Once again, we have to ration the jobs. How do we guarantee that those workers get them? Well, we generally can't, right? Maybe the jobs are allocated randomly. Maybe they're given out via nepotism, racism, whatever. Some other rationing system has to come into play. But we can't guarantee that that will in fact be the case, in which case this rectangle or this trapezoid would be smaller than it otherwise is. Right? Some arbitrary rationing scheme would do things differently. If we shaded in the rectangle and thought about it a little more as we did last time, you might think about this as all of these people from 0 to 1,500 who are supplying jobs. Well, you know what? They're getting $15 an hour, but they would have worked for $7.50, $7.50. So maybe they're willing to dissipate that additional money to get a job, right? How might they do this? The same way as we suggested before. They might engage in direct sort of payments, maybe not, in money, or maybe in money, like behind the scenes, or maybe in kind, right? Doing favors, I don't know. Here's a car. Maybe I'll work extra off the books just to have the job. Yeah.
Just to clarify, the green rectangle represents the scale of the deadweight loss and how it can be changed in different situations?
I would say that the green rectangle is you can think about it as the gain that the most efficient workers in this case get from having a job in this market, right? Versus what they would have taken to work. So maybe that's a better way to say it. So all of these people in the blue area here, they would have worked for $7.50. They're getting 15, right? If you look at that difference, 15 minus 7.5 gives you 7.5, and add it up. That's kind of what you'd spend to get a job then, right? If push came to shove. And so, right, I think I said it a little bit better there. So maybe it's kickbacks, maybe it's working extra, doing favors, whatever. It could even be just something like engaging in search, right? And the same things apply as applied in the rent control case, right? Sometimes this amounts to flows going back to the consumers, the businesses in this case. Sometimes it's just dissipated. It's lost resources. So in some sense, if you think about this picture, this is again a rosy scenario for what is lost due to the price floor, right? Just the gray rectangle, the deadweight loss. It's likely that the losses are larger. Okay, so I have a couple minutes here, so I'm just going to say some things about this. Usually, in both of these markets I'm deliberately being a little provocative here using these two markets. They're always in the news and people have strong opinions about them. That's why it's interesting, right? Usually the argument is, well, a $10 wage in my example isn't fair. Or a $3,000 apartment isn't fair. Fair relative to what? I mean, it'd be nice if everybody had a $100 an hour job, right? But unfortunately, resources are scarce, right? You have to allocate things some ways, and if you don't let a market do it, something else that's even worse might wind up doing it, right? And indeed, that's, I would assert, is often the case, right? So you have to kind of think about the counterfactual, and that's particularly important in regards fairness, right? Oftentimes, people don't mention it. So it's interesting. I'll show you some evidence in a second here. And if you think about who gets squeezed out of the market first in these cases, well, a lot of times it's maybe the people who are kind of at the margin anyway. So with minimum wages, for example, oftentimes what happens is teenage employment is the first thing to go, right, as a result of a minimum wage law. These are people who are willing to work at low wages, mainly because they're doing other things, right, building experience. It's their first job. They don't have a track record, all of those things. They tend to be the first to be squeezed out of the market. And it bears mentioning that there are arguments, both pro and con, if you're thinking about this. Professor Deb and I used to argue about this, and we were saying, well, these kids, maybe they would be better served going to school anyway, would be Deb's side of the argument. And he would say, well, if they have to go to school instead of getting a job, that's fine. And I would say, well, minimum wage, these low wage jobs, they have this purpose, right? You learn, even if you're tough work. I used to work in a physical labor for minimum wage when I was a teenager, and it was hard, but I would argue that I learned skills like getting up early and showing up on time and suffering quietly, things like that, right? All important life skills at various times. So you can argue back and forth, but of course, none of that, my point is, none of those things are in our supply and demand diagram. Doesn't mean they're not important. They may be the thing that the whole argument turns on. So there's that. Empirical work. So I guess I'll just show you a couple of things about this. The minimum wage, this recent paper came out. Once again, I showed you the very first class, the MBER website. And of course, there's a million studies of minimum wages and what they do, and they produce results that are all over the place, right? There's different data sets, different research designs, all of that stuff. So what do they say in general? This essay or this paper summarizes all of the results, and you can see a clear preponderance of negative estimates, meaning it seems like minimum wages reduce employment. If you just give me 3 more minutes, we'll be good here. Right? Okay. There's evidence. The evidence is stronger for negative employment effects on teens. And so you get stronger effects from directly affected workers. Low-wage industries in general is less one-sided, meaning maybe there's something about a minimum wage that's not so bad in a low-wage industry if you study it from that perspective. Interesting food for thought. We'll keep that one for down the road. So let's have a look at rent control. So by the way, if you ever want a little tip here, if you ever want to think about the effects of X on Y, and you want to look at what the evidence says, throw meta-study into your Google search, because a meta-study summarizes, all the papers that have been written in a systematic way. So this one studies a whole bunch of studies of rent control, and these are the sorts of effects that it tabulates across these studies. So some of these have to do with things that we're talking about in this class. Some things are not on our diagram. Once again, that might matter. So let's see. Most of the studies, that minus column means that most of the studies, upper left here, showed that when you have rent control, rents are lower. The next column says that most studies suggest mobility goes down. So people move apartments less frequently, and so maybe there's an argument to be made for supporting neighborhood stability, right? So people don't keep moving in and out. Home ownership goes way up, right? Upper right-hand corner. Not surprising. Maybe you sell the units instead of rent them, or if you can't rent, you buy. Construction goes down. Quality goes down. Uncontrolled rents, that is to say units that are not in the rent control segment of the market, go up, right? Their rents go up. Supply goes down, and misallocation goes up. Well, what is misallocation? This is you have the single person living in a 4-bedroom apartment, right? So you have someone who's overhoused, I guess. So that tends to happen more often in a rent-controlled situation. So the last thing I'll mention here is this begs the obvious question is, if you buy my graphical case here, just working through the graphs the way we have, suggesting that there's deadweight loss and more from these interventions in the market, why do we have so much of it, right? There's always a national debate about rent control and all of that stuff. You might say, that, well, this is because there are all these other things that aren't on the diagram that are more important than what is. Fine. But one sort of argument I like is that the arguments, or the unrepresented, I'll say, important interests that figure into that are so prominent in our analysis, I'll say, don't often figure into other analyses. So our counterfactual, in some ways, accentuates an interest that disappears in the market, right? So think about it this way. In a rental market, there's people who have apartments, there's landlords, and there's people who want to get apartments either now or in the future, right? Those people often don't figure into the typical analysis, but they are on the supply and demand diagram in the counterfactual, right? The same is true of a labor market. There's people who have jobs. There's people who hire workers, employers and workers, but then there's not really a representation of those who might want to get a job in this labor market, right? So when you just pit the established interests against one another, oftentimes you wind up with this situation. But as economists, we have this very clear and nice view of the I guess you could say, the hidden interests as well. The implied interests, maybe that's a better word. So I will leave it at that, and I will see you after the weekend with some practice exam material.